see if I can make it through this book recording marathon. I've just been so very busy. Let me see if I can scooch this just a smidgen. Ugh. There's something on my hand. Anyway, I've been so busy, and somehow I made it through 3 books in almost as many weeks, and I simply have not had time to talk about them. So here we go. The first book that I'm going to be talking about is The Disappearances by Emily Bain Murphy. This is a book that I discovered quite a few years ago. I didn't enjoy it quite as much as I remember enjoying it the first time, but that's not a big surprise. I find that there's just something changed in me, and things that I used to really like, I tend to find problems with. It is basically like a mystery, and it centers around this town that loses some sensory bit every 7 years. We are introduced first to the main character, who is Ayla. She is 17 years old, and she has a younger brother named Miles. They are having to move to their mother's hometown because the mother had recently died and the father is now being sent off to war. It is set in the 1940s. And we switch between Ayla's perspective and this other guy named Stefan. His point of views span a decade or two. And a little bit of spoiler, we learn that Stefan was Ayla's mother's foster brother, that they had been adopted when they were younger and they had grown up in this house, and that what was special about their mother and what made the town dislike Ayla and Miles so much is that the mother did not, her name is Juliet, she was unaffected by the disappearances, by the things that were taken away every 7 years. And so because of that, she was able to leave town and not be affected, or like lead a normal life. And so I have one question. This is the question that really plagued me as I read this book. If I'm gathering correctly, any descendant, any person who is somehow from this town is affected by the disappearances, no matter where they are. So how or why were Ayla and Miles able to grow to the ages they were without being affected? I could understand how then once they came within the town's limits, they would be affected. But then once they left the town, my understanding is that they would no longer be affected. And so, like, I understand that, but I don't quite get it. And so I don't know why the townsfolk despised them so much, except for the fact that they felt like Juliet abandoned them. Like, she took her magical gift and left. But I was like, why, in a sense, why is Ayla so worried about the rest of her life if she's not going to stay in this town? Like, why? I did not understand the correlation of how and when and why they affected her in certain places in time. Like, it just didn't seem like that big of a concern to me. But she's 17 and she has all of her faculties. Then she arrives in this town, and again, this is where I didn't quite understand how the disappearances worked, because I understand that they lose their sense of color. So anything that came from this town, just like the people, had no color. And it was only certain things. It wasn't everything, which that took me a minute to catch on to. I was like, wait a minute. Why is that door beige, but then her dress has color? So it only applied to certain things. Why is it that Ayla and Miles automatically couldn't see anything, couldn't see any of these colors? Or if they were able to taste before, why is it that they could only taste things that, so there are these things called the variants, basically pixie dust, that somebody had come up with as ways to combat some of the disappearances. And so why is it that Ayla and Miles could taste things until they were in the city limits, and then they couldn't taste anything at all without the variants. Stuff like that, where as I was trying to remember some of the terminology, Murphy did try to explain it, but I felt like even when they first discovered that something was wrong, I felt like it was all just a little bit rushed. I would have liked a little bit more explanation as to why, because there's a girl named Bees who's from this town, and she's dating a boy who's not from this town. And so whenever he's in this town, does that mean for this brief period of time suffers from the same afflictions? Or because he's an out-of-towner, he's not afflicted at all? I thought there were little things that could have used a little bit more development, but on the whole, not a problem. Let me back up. Ayla and Miles go to live at the home of their mother's childhood best friend, Matilda Clifton. She is married to the guy who discovered the variants, and they had been in a friend group as well with Stefan, the foster brother. And we learned very early on that Stefan is bitter. Somehow, like, he has this thing for birds, and so somehow Juliet comes to him and is like, hey, can I borrow this one ingredient? And I don't know why he thought he needed to be included in it. I don't know where he belonged within this friend group, but this ingredient then became the reason that the variants started to be discovered. And so he was extremely bitter that he was not included in the celebration, the praise for discovering a variant. They childhood sweethearts, and they are married, and they now have a son named Will, who is Ayla's age. If you're not picking up where this is going, Ayla starts to fall in love with Will. And this is problematic for me only because, okay, first off, I thought that too lacked a little bit of development. Second, later on in the novel, and this is something I think is so clever, is when I think of senses, I think taste, touch, smell, hearing, those kinds of things. So what I thought was really clever that Murphy did was she expanded the senses. So later in the book, one of the senses that they lose is the inability to hear the person you love, which actually I thought was hilarious, because she goes on to be like, well, Mr. So-and-so couldn't hear Mrs. So-and-so, but Mrs. So-and-so could hear Mr. So-and-so. However, she couldn't hear the baker. So I thought it was really funny how obviously, like, I don't know what the implication is supposed to be, but the understanding is marital secrets did not stay marital secrets. But Ayla eventually loses the ability to hear Will. And then, spoiler, we learned that Will, for some time, had been unable to hear Ayla, which it was really sweet. I liked them together. I liked them as a couple. But it's been 3 months. Like, is 3 months the magic number for YA novels and kids and teenagers falling in love? I don't understand why that is the timeline for these people to know each other and to fall in love. I just don't get it. And as I said, I wished I'd had a little bit more development, a little bit more between the two. I thought it lacked a little something, like they orbited each other, but they didn't actually come in contact with each other. And when they did come in contact, like he would walk her home from things. We didn't see that. We didn't see them getting to know each other. We didn't really see much of Will. It felt like one of those instances where he's just that attractive guy who she's falling in love with. Yes, he does nice things. He's a stand-up guy, but he was more of a face than a person. Aside from the fact that I'm like, oh, give me a break. It's been 3 months. I wanted a little bit more of him so that I could see why she would fall in love with him. She is living with the Cliftons, and this is really when I thought maybe I missed something. When we first learn about the variants, like the first hint is that when Ayla and her brother arrive at the Cliftons' home, they are soaking wet from the rainstorm when they get inside, but Mrs. Clifton and Will are not. So that's our first clue that something's going on. The second clue is, yeah, when she's walking through town with Mrs. Clifton and she notices that the door has no color, and bam, there we go. Like, I thought there was going to be a little bit more lead up to the disappearances. Like, Mrs. Clifton was going to try to keep it a secret a little bit longer. Instead, she outright is like, this is what's going on. We have no explanation as to why your mother was not affected, but she wasn't, and we're not going to talk about it because prying ears, you know what I'm saying? So Ayla is going through school. She does meet an arch nemesis who, I can't remember her name. She's not really that important. We are introduced to this tournament, this sisters tournament, because there are 3 towns that are affected by the disappearances. Because Ayla has an affinity for playing darts, she starts getting involved in a game called Stars. It just reminds me of like throwing those ninja stars, and there's an objective, and so that is what she does, because I guess everybody in this town has to be involved. And her main opponent is this girl named Margot Templeton. There are a lot of theories as to why the disappearances started, and one of them does date back to Margot Templeton and then a friend of Ayla's whose name is George. They're supposed to get married and do all these things to like break the curse because of what happened back with their families. And so George is like this girl, this Margot, like, I don't like her. I can't stand her. And I don't like the way she looks at me. She absolutely hates me. And we find out she doesn't hate him. She actually likes him. Ayla does get involved with that. And that is like a minor plot point where we see her going to practice and this and that and the other. But a bigger piece of the puzzle is that her mother had a ring. And Ayla, as she's preparing to leave her own home, wants to take something of her mother's with her. She initially wanted to take a teacup that still had the lipstick stain from her mother, but then it turns out that somebody had washed it. So she goes upstairs and she grabs a book of Shakespeare's sonnets. And then while on the train ride to her new home, she discovers that there's something hidden inside the book, and it's the ring. We also find a letter from her mother to this person that we don't know yet named Stefan. It's signed Viola, but it's in her mother's handwriting, so Ayla's like, I have no idea what this is about, but I'm going to keep the ring. So she puts it on a necklace around her neck and goes along with her days. One thing, I think my biggest problem, pet peeve about this book is Miles. We are immediately clued into the fact that he's problematic, which is fine. Problematic is interesting. But I never felt like it was explained as to why he was problematic. So there's one point where Miles notices the ring and she basically lies and says, well, mother left this for me. There's something of a competition between them. He's like, oh, well, she didn't leave me anything and blah, blah, blah. At some point in the book, Ayla wakes up and she can't find the necklace. She, for some reason, decides to take it off at night. And so when she wakes up, it's gone. Her first person that she grills is Miles, and he convincingly tells her he didn't take it. He has no idea where it is. When in fact, he did take it because he was jealous and because he didn't want Ayla to have this ring. I wanted to know why. I get it. Kids can be brats. But I wanted to know what it was about Miles that made him so difficult. Because he was difficult to the point that this is why they had to go and live with the Cliftons, because nobody they knew would have taken him in. That's pretty serious. I wanted to know why he got to behave the way he did. I had no explanation whatsoever as to anything, and he continually got away with his bad behavior. And even like the one time Ayla tries to put her foot down, she later comes back around and apologizes for the way that she spoke to him. And I'm like, obviously this kid needs a spanking. So I thought Miles was incredibly underdeveloped. He felt like a tool, a vehicle, a reason that things could go wrong. And I hated any scene that he was in because he was such a brat. Let's just kind of skip forward through some things because I'm not fresh. It's time for another disappearance. This time the disappearance is music, which mortifies B because music is her life. only for Dr. Clifton and George to discover the antidote. What Ayla discovers is that everything is tied to Shakespeare, even the fact that there are 7-year gaps between the disappearances. And it turns out that all of the antidotes, all of the variants come from lines in Shakespeare. And here's a little point of contention I had. They have a variant which, if they put it on their eye, they have better insight into things. It's one of those banned substances at school because it can help you cheat. So she puts some on her eyes because it helps her. I don't remember exactly what she wanted to do. If the purpose was just to remember her mother, or if the purpose was to better focus on the task at hand and figuring out the variants, or how Shakespeare relates back to the disappearances. And so she gets a slight answer. Something that she had seen in her mother's Shakespeare book reminded her of something else, and she was like, oh my gosh, I think, it was Miles. Miles had lost a tooth. And so in this town, nobody can dream. That's something that's been taken away from them. And Miles had come to her one day and he's like, oh, well, I had a dream last night. After she has this stuff on her eyes, she notices a line and it has to do with teeth. And she realizes that, oh my gosh, Miles had a tooth under his pillow. So I was just like, why didn't you use this variant more often? Like, if it helped you once, why didn't you continue to use it in order to see more into Shakespeare's works, to find the answers that you're looking for? Because she goes to Dr. Clifton and she goes to George and she's like, look, this is my theory. I think everything is connected to Shakespeare. And they shoot her down. They're like, oh, but this came from some other writer, some other classical writer. So how in the world could everything be tied back to Shakespeare if we found answers here? Well, the answers were still in Shakespeare. They just weren't as obvious. So I was just, I don't know. Maybe because the book is not supposed to be easy, but I found myself, after that first use, I was like, why don't you just keep using it? Because of all the Shakespeare stuff and whatnot, Dr. Clifton and George are able to come up with an antidote to not being able to hear music. But then not long after that is when the whole I can't hear my loved one thing comes from. And everybody is in a panic. Like, they have no idea why they lost another sense so soon. Let's just get into some nitty gritty. Turns out that Stefan is not Juliet's adoptive brother, but it's actually her biological brother. The thing about Stefan, I could have done without his perspectives. There wasn't really enough to them that I felt they were necessary. I thought that we could have gotten our answers without him, which also reminds me, I was surprised that more of this book wasn't devoted to why the disappearances are happening and how we can get rid of them. I really thought that's what the book would have been about. If I showed up in a town and all of a sudden I couldn't hear or taste or smell, I'd be like, I'm not putting up with this. Like, can we get down to the heart of the matter? But Juliet, I don't know, like, he had been crippled in some form or fashion growing up. Don't quite know to what extent, because by the time we meet him in the book, he knows how to walk. Again, just little things. Right after Juliet discovers that she is unaffected by the disappearances, let's make it clear, the disappearances started the year of their birth because they're twins. She must have been affected by the disappearances up until she was 17, at which point she saw her reflection, which is something that they hadn't been able to see, in a lake. And then she runs off. He's gonna go after her, only for Mrs. Clifton, Matilda, to approach him. And he's like, I just don't understand why she wasn't affected, but I am. And Matilda's like, what do you mean? Like, you're not actually related. At which point he's like, is that what she's been telling you? He confronts Juliet and she admits that it was accidental, but then at a certain point she didn't correct anybody. So yeah. So he's just super angry at her. And when I first met Stefan, like, you get romantic anger vibes, like he's in love with her. Turns out he'd actually been in love with Matilda. But I wanted more of them. We meet him because he has finally found his biological father. The mother had died in childbirth, and the father had gone to jail. He had been a grave robber, a pickpocket, a thief. In his grief, he'd gotten careless, he'd gotten caught, he was sent to jail. Now he is out, and Stefan has found him. The dad's name is Phineas. So he ends up living with Phineas for an odd number of years, learns his father's trade, and this is how they're able to live, gain some kind of wealth. But then Phineas starts showing signs of bronchitis or something. He starts dying. He has this cough and he is dying. He has admitted to Stefan that he thinks he is responsible for the disappearances. At this point, we legit change course. He admits it, and then for the rest of the book, we have no idea what he means. It's not that I necessarily needed to know why, but I did wish that Stefan had brought it up more, had brought it up again as to, like, I'm stunned at my father's revelation, blah, blah, blah. So it's not that I necessarily need to know what the revelation is. I just didn't think we should have blown past it like nothing happened. We do go through more of the book before we find out. I mean, it's literally at the end of the book that we find out what it was. Stefan reveals, or he prompts Phineas into this tale that apparently Phineas has told him before, about how when the mother had been sick, he would have done anything to make her better, and he'd heard tales about a stone. And so he had borrowed an obscene amount of money to buy this stone. The caveat with buying this stone is that you had to take this other box along with it. All of the other bidders were like, we are not taking that box, so here, you can have the stone. Of course, by the time that Phineas gets the stone, his wife has already died, so it's a moot point. But in the other box are Shakespeare's bones. He had buried these bones, guess how many places? 3 places, which is why we have that sisters tournament. That is why those 3 towns are the ones that are affected, because apparently Shakespeare had this big fear about someone robbing his grave and taking his bones, and so his bones were cursed, and ergo anywhere that those bones had been buried was going to be cursed. This is when Ayla and her friends dig up the bones, they reunite them, and then they rebury them in the ruins of her mother's old house. I don't know why the house had been burned down. I can't remember if it was on purpose, if it was on accident, but that's where they buried the bones, and everything goes back to normal. Ayla and Will proclaim their love for each other. Actually, they'd already done that. Like, they'd already admitted that they couldn't hear each other, and they'd been dating in secret. One thing I did neglect to mention is that Phineas dies, and Stefan's like, all right, it's time for me. Like, I need to find that stone. Stefan had asked me to find that stone. He had reached out to Juliet, and she'd said that she was going to get it cleaned, and then she was going to send him the ring, and then she never did because she ended up dying. He was like, one of the kids must have the stone. So he does track them down to this town. I guess that surprising disappearance occurs. Does he redistribute the bones? He does something that ropes another town into this disappearing act, which I thought was really intriguing. It's one thing to lose things slowly. It's another to all of a sudden have nothing at all. So I was like, whoa, like that would have been an experience, you know what I'm saying? There are the variants, which Dr. Clifton had concocted, and then there were a different set of variants, like the ones that you put in your eyes, and other ones that are not so savory that another guy had come up with. Naturally, there was competition between them, or at least between the other guy towards Dr. Clifton. Stefan teams up with this guy because he has decided, you know what about virtues? And so virtues are things like peace. So he has spent a good amount of time trying to figure out how to extract peace from a person. Now he thinks he's got it figured out, but he has to get to Ayla. He has to get that ring. So he goes to the Cliftons' house, and he basically is holding the Cliftons hostage. Ayla somehow has realized that there's danger. She arrives at the house and she's caught. She's trying to hide the ring. In the process, the co-conspirator jabs Mrs. Clifton in the neck with the needle in order to extract her peace, which is the last thing that Stefan wanted because he was still in love with her. Although, you know what? If he was really in love with her, how could he hear her voice? But I digress. This angers Stefan so much that he shoots the other guy. In any case, the hypnosis variant does not work on Ayla. I don't remember why, but it doesn't. She is able to injure Stefan. They're able to escape. He goes to jail, only for him to then escape jail. And this is where she and her friends get the map to where the bones are buried, because he leaves it for her, which I thought there's a little lack of resolution with what happened to him. He just disappears into the night. I would have liked one more chapter of his from afar, like him, I don't know, riding away in the train, or thinking, or like watching all of the disappearances return to this town, something that ties up his storyline. Instead, he just disappears. We learn that this ring that had the stone in it, was the reason not only for Juliet to be immune to the disappearances, but is the reason that she died. The thing about the ring, as I had already mentioned, is it heals people. It makes people healthy. Phineas had left the ring to Juliet and Stefan's foster mother in case they needed money, I guess, at some point. Not quite sure. Stefan had given the ring to Juliet, I guess. And so as soon as Juliet started wearing it, this is when she became impervious to the disappearances, and that's when she left. And we get this running thread of how healthy she was, of how she was never sick. And it's because of this ring. However, it's kind of like a suppressant in a way, so that it suppressed all of the bad health that could have occurred to her. Yet when she took it off to get it cleaned, to send back to Stefan, it all just came rushing back at her, and she died. This is something that I thought, again, could have developed a little bit more, because we do have that moment of when Ayla wakes up and the ring is gone and she just has this really terrible headache. So there's a hint, a clue put into the book at some point, and you do understand that the ring is important. There is significance to this symbol, but I thought we could have had a little bit more. But overall, I thought it was a good book. Ayla and Miles' father ends up coming home at the end of the book because he gets injured and therefore he cannot continue fighting. So happily ever afters all the way around. I thoroughly enjoyed it. I thought it had a good voice. I liked Ayla. As much as I wanted more from her relationship with Will, it was a sweet little romance. I liked that they got together. I enjoyed Bees and George, Ayla's best friends. Although I thought that her best friend from home, Cass, was sort of pointless. There was a huge emphasis put on her at the beginning, which I completely understand. Because Ayla is leaving everything she knows. She's leaving her best friend. Like, she'd had all these big plans, and now she can't partake in any of them because she's going somewhere else. But I wish that Cass had had a bigger role throughout the novel. Not even a big role, but a bigger presence. We get a couple of mentions of her, a couple letters, but she fades relatively quickly. If she was going to be there, I would have liked to have de-emphasized her in the beginning, because you're almost set up to expect more from her. But it was a great little book. It was super creative. I definitely recommend it. It's one of those books that I'm sure a lot of people haven't heard of, but I recommend it, and I would love to read more from Emily Bain Murphy. So there we go. What do you think? See you next week.